Let me ask you this question. Have you ever been accused of something that you didn't do, right? Yeah, everybody, right? If you're a kid, your hand should be raised. My own son raises his hand, so I wonder what that's all about. But did anybody watch the World Cup? Yeah, mercy sakes. The World Cup was full of that, right? I mean, every time, and I always loved it because the guy wouldn't get touched. He would fall like he just got shot in the back or something. And then the guy who didn't touch him, he would be jumping up pleading his case. But you were always accused of something you didn't do, or they were accused of something you didn't do. Have you ever been accused of something you didn't do? Remember that time. And I got a story, a specific story, and it was with my mother. And I don't remember what I got in trouble for, but it warranted a spanking. And my mom had the wooden spoon. How many moms use wooden spoons here? Evil, just evil. Evil. That thing, and she knew how to whip that thing out from anywhere. Like, we're driving in the car, and the next thing she's got a wooden spoon. I mean, and just, it is crazy how she could use this wooden spoon. Mom practiced that. I know she did. She had to have. And if, Mom, you're listening to this, then I'm just joking. But you never wanted to cross Mom, especially when you knew you were in the kitchen, because you knew she had a stack of 12 of those things. She bought the packs, right? So anyway, so I get handed to me with this wooden spoon. And so it gets to the point where I'm crying, because I figured out the sooner you start crying, the sooner Mom stops, right? So first swat, I'm crying, and the tears are rolling. Now let me ask you this question. When you start crying and the tears are rolling and they hit your lips, what do you do? Somebody, feel free. What do? You lick them, right? You get that salty tear and you lick them. So, Jesse, you do something different, I take it? I look over there and Pam's like, bam, watch the wooden spoon. But you lick your lips, right? That's what you do. And so I had just finished getting tore up by this wooden spoon. It somehow disappeared, not in the picture. I'm crying, and the tears touch my lips, so I lick them. Right? Mom sees it. Mom says, "Did you just stick your tongue out at me?" And before I got the red card, before I could even say anything, that spoon was bad. It was redo. It was like a mulligan, Mom did. And I'm like, I can't, what do I do now? They're on my lips now. What do I do? I didn't know. But I was accused of something I didn't do. And I think we all can sit here and say we have these stories. How did it make you feel? That's the story that you have on your mind. How did it make you feel? Not fair. I didn't do anything, but yet I got accused for it. Well, in Acts chapter 6, if you have your Bibles, turn to Acts chapter 7, but we're going to start in Acts chapter 6. I'm going to give you some background story about a man named Stephen. In Acts chapter 6, we're going to see Stephen was a young man who was accused of something he didn't do. And then we're also going to be introduced to a young man named Saul as well. But I want to start off with Stephen. And where I want to start with Stephen is kind of lay the background story. This was after Jesus Christ was crucified on the cross. This was after that, and there was a lot of persecution going on. Those who pronounced that Jesus Christ was the Son of God, there was a lot of persecution among those people. But Stephen, who knew Jesus, was out there preaching Jesus Christ. Well, some of the people started hearing it. Some of the people of the city of Jerusalem started hearing it, and they didn't like it. So they started spreading these blasphemy rumors about him. Hey, this guy Stephen, he's preaching about Jesus being the Son of God. Now, does that sound familiar? What did Jesus get crucified for, right? Pronouncing that he was Son of Man, Son of God. So here we have Stephen, and these people are spreading these lies. Well, eventually these lies came to the high priest. And the high priest said, you know what? Go ahead, bring him in. Let's put him on trial. Let's see what he has to say. Let's see if he defends himself. He's going to be put on trial. So he gets put on trial. And these high priests say, hey, Stephen, what do you have to say for yourself? What do you have to say about what these things these guys are saying? And these witnesses who are saying they witnessed you saying blasphemous things in public, what do you have to say about it? And Stephen really didn't give an argument. He kind of gave a weak argument. And his weak argument was basically he preached to them. He didn't really say no or yes. He just kind of preached to them. So if you have your Bibles, let's check out chapter 7, and we're going to start in verse 56. And it says in 56, and he said, behold, I see the heavens opened up and the Son of Man standing at the right hand of God. Now, as he's given this dissertation and trial, he says this. And he says, Son of Man. Now, this is the last time, an interesting point, this is the last time that the Son of Man is actually used in the Bible. It's not used any time after that, but it's a messianic title. It's a title that's given to a God or a Messiah, and it's given to Jesus in this point. But also, when you look back in Jesus' earthly ministry, it was a name that Jesus gave himself. I am the Son of Man. And Jesus mentions that he's the Son of Man several times, and it's a self-proclaimed title that Jesus gives it. And then now Stephen's using it. And then he's saying not only that, but this Jesus, he's not dead. He's standing at the right hand of God. Read on in verse 57. It says, But they cried out, they meaning the priests at the trial, cried out with a loud voice and covered their ears and rushed at him with one impulse. When they had driven him out of the city, they began stoning him, and the witnesses laid aside their robes at the feet of a young man named Saul. 59, it says, They went on stoning Stephen as he called on the Lord and said, Lord Jesus, receive my spirit. Verse 60, Then falling on his knees, he cried out with a loud voice, Lord, do not hold this sin against them. Having said this, he fell asleep. Now, how the people were stoned, and kind of give you a background on this little incident that took place. The Mosaic law said that the witnesses who cast these verbal stonings, the witnesses who put this blame, they were responsible for the act itself of stoning. And so what they were required to do in the Mosaic law required that at least 2 or 3 minimum of these witnesses that made this accusations about the victim or the accused, they had to go to the stoning site with them. And once they were at the stoning site, they were the first ones to be casting the stones. The witnesses who accused this person of these blasphemous things, in this case Stephen, those witnesses were required to be the first to cast a stone. And then after that, after they cast, then those around can commence on, casting the stones themselves. But once the stoning site was reached, and I do say stoning site because when we think of a stoning and an incident of such, we think they drive them out of the city, they take them out of the city, and when they get out of the city, they just throw them down on the ground. And as they throw them down on the ground, everybody gets rocks and starts casting at them. But the stoning site was actually a pit. And it was sometimes 10 to 12 feet deep. Sometimes you would find some shallower than 6 feet. I guess if they got tired of digging, they would only dig to 6 feet. But generally, they were a deep pit. And as the victim or the accused would walk to the stoning site, that was the time as they were walking him out of the city for him to get right with God, him to confess that the ways that he did, that he was accused of, were wrong. Stephen never did that. We don't see accounts of that. But then the accused would stand in front of this pit, and as he's standing in front of the stoning pit, one of the witnesses would come behind him, either kick him or push him in the pit. And their hope was that 10 to 12 foot fall would kill him so they wouldn't have to commit stoning. But if it didn't, the stoning would commence. And when we think of this act, when we think of a stoning, we think of maybe like a rock. And I think of what I did, I would think of rocks like this. Something that you could really grab and you could, put your weight into and you could really hum, right? When we think of throwing rocks, I don't pick up the biggest rock known to man to try and throw it. I want to see if I can throw it across the lake like a man would do, right? I don't want to throw it in the lake. I want to throw it across the lake because that's what men do. We try and see who can throw it the furthest. And if you have 2 or 3 people there on the side of the lake, you guarantee it's going to turn into a competition of rock throwing, right? You guys know what I'm talking about. Don't look at me like I'm strange. We all do it. We all have competition. Thanks, Stephen. Stephen does. But we think of stones like this. We think of something that you can kind of put in your hand and you can really let loose. That's not the stones they used. The stones they used were something like this. And it was a stone that was a 2-handed stone. It was a stone that you had to have and you could hold with 2 hands. And what they would do with these size stones, they would lift them up over their head. And when they would lift them up over their head, they would use all of their muscles that they could possibly use and lunge them down in that 10 to 12 foot pit. So you can imagine the velocity of these grown men casting a stone this size over their head. I better put it down before I hurt myself. But you can imagine the size of that stone and the power that could be generated. You can imagine a person down at the bottom of this pit and the destruction something like that would do to a leg, to an arm. It would break it. Something it would do to a head, to ribs. I mean, you could just imagine the devastation that would happen during this stoning. You can imagine what would happen to a human body during this time. And this is what Stephen did. And in the midst of all this, while Stephen was being stoned, he cries out. Lord Jesus, receive my spirit. And then in verse 60, he says, do not hold this sin against them. Forgive them, as he's being stoned. But during this entire event of this stoning, this brutal attack on somebody who was accused of something that he didn't do, somebody who could easily have said, this isn't fair. You're wrong. You're accusing me wrong. He just said, Lord, forgive them. But during this entire event, we see a young man named Saul. Now, in this young man named Saul, we see in verse 58 that Saul, he approves of the stoning of Stephen. And as Stephen says, Lord, receive my spirit, the Lord, do not hold the sin against him. Saul, we see in later accounts, he never forgets that, indicating that Saul was right there of it. Okay, who is this Saul? Who is Saul? And I want to talk a few minutes about this guy named Saul. And this is what I want you to really get, is just what kind of man Saul was. He was of Tarsus, and he was known as Saul of Tarsus, right? Saul came from Tarsus of Cilicia. Now, no doubt, as I had said, there were started to be men who started to accuse Stephen of these false and blasphemous sayings, right? No doubt that Saul was one of them. That's my accusation, or my own interpretation of Acts chapter 6. And if you read with me in verse 9, it says, but some men from what was called the synagogue of the freedmen, including both Cyrenians and Alexandrians and some from Cilicia and Asia, rose up and argued with Stephen. Remember, Saul was from Cilicia, and it says they argued with him. They argued, why are you saying these things? These are blasphemous sayings. You're wrong. And no doubt Saul was part of that. Saul was part of that crowd. Saul was listening in. Saul knew what was going on. And we see that Saul, in later chapters of Acts, that not only did he knew, but he knew what he was talking about. Because a little background on Saul was he went to a school called Gamaliel, and it's in the city of Jerusalem. Now, this school was well known, and it was well known throughout Jerusalem, as this is the school, if you want to become a scholar, a rabbi, some sort of priest in a synagogue, this is the school you went to, because they're the ones that raised up prominent rabbis, scholars, priests for the nation and for the Roman Empire throughout and in Jerusalem. This is where they would go, okay? And so he knew that. And Saul was a well-educated man, and he was well-educated in Judaism and Christianity. So he knew what he was talking about. So when he argued with Stephen, and when Saul would argue and Saul would talk, he knew what he was talking about. He wasn't some young guy who didn't know anything. And Saul, he had a choice, and he knew enough about Christianity and Judaism that those two couldn't coexist. And the basic background and premise of Judaism is that you didn't need a savior. You followed the commandments and the laws of the Torah, which is the first 5 books, and that was how you got through life. You followed these laws of the Torah, and if you did, you would do enough good things that you would be favored and showed favor in the sight of the Lord. You didn't need this Jesus Christ. But Christianity is based on Jesus Christ being the Savior of the world. It's based on understanding and believing in Him as the Son of God. So Saul had made up in his own biased point of view that these two couldn't coexist. So Saul already knew that Jesus Christ was dead. And as he saw it, Christianity was a cult. And it was a cult against Judaism, what he believed in. So Saul said, you know what? Jesus Christ is already dead. He didn't rise. I don't believe he rose from the dead. He's dead in the grave. So the leader of this cult's already dead. My job now is to get rid of the people who were followers of this cult and a follower of this guy named Jesus Christ. Jesus of Nazareth. Let's get rid of those guys. And if I can get rid of those guys, then Christianity would get rid of, and then Judaism would be the prominent religion. There wouldn't be anything to go against Judaism, and we would be able to just live happily ever after. That's what Saul had set in his mind, and he set forth to do it, and he did it really well. And as we read on, let's skip down to Acts, and this is just after the stoning of Stephen. And it says, Acts 8, verse 1, it says, now Saul was consenting of his death. That consenting, it just means he was an approval of his death. And as we see, and I want to show that Paul was at the pit. We see that Saul was at the stoning, but we don't want to think that Saul was just in the back of the crowd looking through what's going on up there. No, Saul was very much involved in this stoning. He was very much involved in the first martyr for Jesus Christ. Because we see that they laid down their robes at his feet. We see that he was consenting to his death. Now, laying down their robes means, you know how if you go to the basketball court, whatever sport you play, and if you go and it's cold outside, you have a jacket, maybe some sweats on. When you go to work out, wherever, you strip down to some cooler clothes, something that you can kind of get exercise in, right? And that's the same thing. These hampering robes that these guys wore, they weren't able to cast stones, so they tore them off, and they cast them down right there at the front of this pit. And that's where they get Saul was standing next to that pit of that stoning site, and that's where they cast him down at his feet to show and to indicate that he was right up there in the front, and he was in the midst of this stoning. And we see in 8:3 of Acts, it says, as for Saul, and this was after the stoning of Stephen, he made havoc of the church, entering every house and dragging off men and women, committing them to prison. Why did he do that? Again, Christianity was a cult, and he didn't like that cult. So they would kick down your door just because he heard you said something about Jesus Christ being the Son of God, because you said Jesus Christ is the Savior of the world. And Saul wreaked havoc on you because of what you said. This is who Saul is as a nutshell, and then we're going to move on. Saul was a persecutor. Saul was a blasphemer, an injurer, an unbeliever. In 1 Timothy, we see that he was considered the chief of sinners. And after being all these names, and after talking all these talks and walking all these walks, in the face of all this, in Acts 23, verse 1, he declares that he lived his life in good conscience with God. That's the kind of conviction Saul had, was that he did these things and he felt he was doing them the correct way, the right way in the sight of God. And he felt that this was what God had in store for him. Saul was the most vile, disturbing, and evil man you can meet. I mean, when you saw Saul walking down the street, he was the kind of person that you went the other way. He was the kind of person you found that alley to go through. He was the kind of person that you didn't want to meet, because everything that went with him was death and destruction. Everything that was known by the sheer name Saul of Tarsus was evil. And you didn't want to have nothing to do with that. And there was nothing in Saul's heart but hate and destruction for those who claimed Jesus Christ to be the Son of God. That's who Saul was. And hopefully you can get a brief picture of who Saul was. But here's where the exciting part comes. Because a man with that kind of reputation, a man with that kind of hard heart, a man with that kind of evil, God still found a way to use him for his kingdom and for his glory. Let's go down to Acts chapter 9 and verse 1. And we look in verse 1, and we're going to read verse 1 and 2. It says, Then Saul, still breathing threats and murder against the disciples of the Lord, went to the high priest and asked letters from him to the synagogues of Damascus, so that if he found anyone who were of the way, whether men or women, he might bring them bound to Jerusalem. Saul had gotten word that there was a group of Christians in Damascus. Saul wreaking havoc in Jerusalem. Saul, just kicking down doors and just doing evil things in Jerusalem. He got this word. So he went to the chief priests and said, hey, here's what's going on in Damascus. There's a sect of people, and they're rising up in Damascus. They're preaching the name Jesus Christ, and Jesus Christ is Lord, and they're preaching everything opposite of what your synagogues that you set in Damascus are preaching. Give me the letters so that I can go to the synagogues and tell them I came on behalf of the high priest of Jerusalem so that I can wreak havoc in Damascus. And I like this little word, and it gets overlooked, but it says the way. And it says, so that if he found anyone who were of the way. And of the way is another way of saying the Christians, the believer in Christ. And the reason they said that was because, again, there was a lot of persecution among Christians. So a lot of the Christians had kind of came up with the code. They came up with the secret, so-called. Obviously, Saul knew it wasn't so secret anymore, right? But it was of the way. Hey, I'm Mark. Hey, Jeremy, how you doing? Are you of the way? I'm of the way. Oh, awesome. I'll invite you in my house, and then we'll talk Jesus Christ, and we'll disciple each other. We'll tell each other of our stories that we had of Jesus Christ. And that was just kind of like the secret code that you knew, okay, well, he was a believer in Christ. It was of the way. And Saul says, you know what? here's the joke on you. I know what of the way means. I'm educated in Christianity. I'm educated in Judaism. I know what the way means. You're not fooling anybody, but high priest grants him these letters to go to Damascus. And from Jerusalem to Damascus, it's about 200 miles. Who's walked 200 miles? Just out of curiosity. No? Okay. I mean, Bethany did. How did it go? How long did it? Oh, it didn't? Okay. I was just curious because I've never walked 200 miles. I've never walked 2 miles, I don't think. Because I've got a car. I had a bicycle growing up. I had a train, airplane. I didn't do 200 miles walking ever. But that's how far this place was. So you can imagine walking is what they had, how long it took them to get there. It wasn't something short. It was a journey. And so Saul had plenty of time to do his thinking. Saul had plenty of time to build up hate for these Christians in Damascus. And you can just kind of sense the evil man he was. You can kind of sense just how he was just getting ready. I'm getting closer. One more day closer. I'm getting closer. And I'm gonna tear these. I mean, he was getting into it. And you can imagine as he's walking to Damascus on this 200-mile journey, how he was feeling about it. And so on this journey to Damascus, the life-changing event occurs for Saul. Read with me in verse 3. It says, as he journeyed, he came near Damascus. And suddenly a light shone around him from heaven. Suddenly a light shone around him from heaven. It was without doubt he knew where it came from. In later accounts in Acts 22 and 26, Saul revisits this account on Damascus, and he tells us that it's about high noon when this shining of a light from heaven occurs. So it was during the day. And he also explains of how bright this light was. He explains of how when you light a candle in the face of the sun, how the candle pales in comparison to the brightness of the sun. And he talks about this light and how this light, the sun paled in comparison to this light. That was how bright it was. And I used to be a kid, and I used to do that challenge. How long could you stare at the sun? And I was blinded for about 2 minutes afterwards, right? But I know everybody at some point tried to stare at the sun to see if you could just actually see the sun. If you didn't, try it when you go home. It's cool. You'll have fun. No, don't do it. But the sun is bright. That is the brightest thing that we have reference to on earth. That is the brightest thing that you have. And Saul is saying on this road, that paled in comparison to this light from heaven. And the reason it's saying light from heaven, because Paul knew where it came from. Saul knew where it came from. In verse 4, it says, then Saul, fell to the ground and heard a voice saying to him, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? Jesus didn't ask, why are you persecuting them? Why are you persecuting the Christians? Why are you persecuting the people? Why are you persecuting those people who believe in Jesus? He said, why are you persecuting me? Now, again, Saul is smart. He knows what he's talking about. It was a rhetorical question because all he can ask in verse 5 is, who are you, Lord? He knows who he is. He's got a pretty good idea because he knows who he's persecuting. He knows whose people he's after. And in verse 5, the Lord said, I am Jesus whom you are persecuting. The only question Saul can ask is, who are you, Lord? That word Lord just instinctively comes from his lips as he knows where this light is coming from. He knows where this voice is coming from. It's coming from the Lord. It's coming from God. It can't come from nobody else. So here he is on the road to Damascus, face down, and the Lord is asking him this question. And the only question that Saul can ask him back is, who are you? And then Jesus gives him the feared, just soul-devastating, heart-wrenching answer and says, I am Jesus whom you are persecuting. Uh-oh. That's not how things were supposed to go, right? That's not what Saul had in mind. Saul was the uh-oh factor. He was, oh no. He was astonished. He was dumbfounded. He had persecuted for so long the Messiah of Israel, the Son of David, the Son of God. He had persecuted the believers and the beloved of heaven. He had persecuted those who were actually the body of Christ. And it was all true. The stories that he had been accusing people of blasphemy, the ways, the stories, the sayings, it was all true. Jesus Christ was the Jesus of Nazareth. He was God in flesh. He was Son of God. He was born of a virgin. He had a marvelous life. He was unique in his person. And now he was falsely accused by the same priest who he serves now. And then he was crucified at the pleading hands of the Jews and hung on a cross by the Romans. And it was all true. And here he is on a dirt road to Damascus, finding it out. And as he had said, the cult of Christianity, Jesus Christ was in the grave. Now, he's seeing that he is risen. He's seeing that this Jesus Christ that he has been persecuting for the name has risen. And now he is sitting on the right hand of the throne of God, which he remembers Stephen saying at his stoning. The transformation has begun. The transformation of Saul's life has begun. And Saul, in verse 6, says, "So he, trembling and astonished, said, 'Lord, what do you want me to do?' Then the Lord said to him, 'Arise and go into the city, and you will be told what you must do.'" Saul doesn't know what else to ask. He doesn't know, what do you want me to do? You tell me what you want me to do, Lord, and I'll do it. But I like the change of events here. And it's really cool because when you read up on Saul, and you read the story of Saul, you see that he had the letters of the chief priests. He had the blessing of the chief priests. He had this ironclad army that followed him and did whatever he was asked to do or told to do. They said, "You know what? Kick down this door and take the women and the husbands and take the men and the women and take them to jail because they're going to stand trial for blasphemy." They kicked down the door and did that. Saul said, "We're going to go here." They went there. Saul said, "Do this." They did that. Saul was given the orders. And I like how now Jesus Christ is given the orders. It's so cool to see that Saul, and just try and picture that, the man who had all this authority is now face down on a desolate road in Damascus, on his way to Damascus. And he's asking the Lord, who he knows now and calls him Lord, after he knows he's Jesus, still calls him Lord and says, "What do you want me to do?" And he says, "I'll tell you what to do. Just go to Damascus. I got this. I don't need you. You need me." And so the rest of the chapter, we see that Saul did do what the Lord had asked him to do, and we see that Saul went to Damascus. We see that Saul went to Damascus, and on his journey was about 3 more days worth of journey that we see that he had before he got to the city. And on those 3 days, after he saw that bright light, he was blinded. And he didn't drink nor eat and could not see for 3 days. And he made it to Damascus. And when he made it to Damascus, Jesus had met with one of his faithful disciples named Ananias. And Ananias was in the city of Damascus. And while he's in that city, he received this vision from Christ and told him what to do. Hey, go to the city, into the city, and go to a street which is called Straight, which is still there today. You can walk that street today in Damascus. And he says, go to that street, and you're going to meet a man named Saul. Man named who? Man named Saul. And he says, no, you're not talking about the Saul of Tarsus, the one that just is looking for me to kill me because I mentioned your name. You're not wanting me to go out and, right? That doubt. How many of us have said that? Jesus, give me sight. Lord, I pray that you give me what I want, but I want your will to be done. Oh, your will's not what I want? What do you mean? Let me pray again. Let me try this again, right? So many times we want God's vision and God's way and God's direction for our life, but yet when he gives it to us, we want to pray again because that's not what we wanted. And I'm sure Ananias is like, wait. Let me make sure you mean the Saul of Tarsus of Cilicia, right? That's the guy you're talking about, right? Is that? Yeah. Oh, it is him, right? So he does what he is told to do by Jesus. because he's a faithful disciple. And he goes out and he finds Saul, and Saul is blinded and weak, and he's in the road wandering. And Ananias takes him, and he takes him into his house. And when he takes him into his house, he receives his sight. And when he receives his sight, he is fed, and he is discipled by the disciples of Damascus. Talk about a change of events, right? And so he receives his strength back. And after spending time with the other disciples, he's ready to go. And look in chapter 9, verse 20 of what happens. Immediately, he preached the Christ in the synagogues, that he is the Son of God. Now, immediately, I looked up the dictionary because I want us all to be on the same page of what immediately means. It's without delay. Pretty straightforward. Just in case there's some deep theological meaning of what immediately means. No, it just means without delay. I love honey buns. Honey buns are my favorite. I can devour a whole box. I have devoured a whole box. You get the 6-pack for 99 cents. They're probably like $1.50 now. Price inflation's crazy. But back in college, they were 99 cents. And I would get this whole pack of honey buns when I was living by myself. Nothing but 2 Dr. Peppers and a pack of honey buns for dinner, right? I love these things. These things, and you can ask my wife, I'm always like, hey, get more honey buns when you go to the store, right? And they disappear so fast. That's what my microwave in college was used for, ramen and honey buns. And I would put these honey buns in the microwave for 10 seconds, 12 seconds if you like them a little warmer than normal. But 10 seconds would work. Trust me, I've tried it all. And you would put these honey buns. And when I heard that bell ring on the microwave, I immediately went to that thing, tore open the package, and devoured these things. I mean, my hands were burned. I didn't care. Just put them in there. No napkin, no nothing. Just greasy ham. I mean, that's immediately. And Paul said immediately, I went to the synagogues. And he went. And he went to the synagogues. Now, here's the cool thing. The synagogues weren't what we're thinking the churches where they teached Christianity. They teach Jesus Christ as Lord. The synagogues were Judaism. They taught, hey, these are the laws you have to follow. This is what you must do. And so Saul was treated as a guest of honor in these synagogues. And so when Saul went to the synagogues, they rolled out the red carpet. Hey, come up here. Here's the finest seat we have. Sit down. Teach us. You came from Jerusalem. No doubt they're expecting maybe something from the high priest of Jerusalem, some cool letter that they wrote to the synagogues that they could hear from Saul. And in their daily readings, they would read these daily readings, these repetition readings every day. And everybody gathered at the synagogue to hear these readings from the priest, but now they're going to hear them from Saul, who came from Jerusalem, who is fighting the war against Christianity, this cult. And so he goes there, and in the midst of all the people, he preaches Jesus Christ is the Son of God. Wow factor, right? That's the wow factor. These guys are here, and okay, what law do I need to learn today? Jesus Christ. I mean, they were, what are you teaching in my synagogue? Jesus Christ. I mean, here it is. You're Saul. You're the one persecuting these people. You're the one that are killing these people just because they mention his name and attach Son of God to it. And then here you are in the midst of a synagogue, and you're standing in front of us, and you're preaching to them out of your own mouth that Jesus Christ is the Son of God, and he's the way, the truth, the life. You're in the middle of me, in the middle of the synagogue. What just happened? I know what happened. Transformation complete. That's what happened. That's exactly what happened. We saw Saul on the road, and we saw Jesus Christ, who had risen, make a special visit to Saul to talk to him and ask him, what are you doing? Transformation complete. And lastly, we see in Acts 13, verse 9, then Saul, who is also called Paul, filled with the Spirit. His name is changed to Paul. And Charles used nothing but Paul in his scriptures in the Lord's Supper. Every time Charles mentioned something in the Lord's Supper, he was referring to Paul and his testimony and his words that he wrote. Because we see Paul. Now, his name, he didn't change his name because he was ashamed of his past. I can tell you that right now. He didn't change his name because he was ashamed of what he had done. As I had told you in Acts 22 and 26, he professes that he did everything in a good conscience before the Lord. In several letters that he wrote, he refers back to when his name was Saul, and he refers back to the actions he did, and he uses them for his own ministry now and for the furtherance of the gospel. He changed his name because the stigmatism, the fear that came with the name Saul of Tarsus. So that when he would go and actually try and do ministry for God, and he would go and try and preach Jesus Christ, what's your name? Saul. Saul of who? Oh, bye. And they would take off running. And he said, I'm not going to let my name hinder my walk for Christ. Paul was transformed from a persecutor of Christians to a preacher of Christ. And he was transformed in this way from just a horrible and vile life. And Paul went on to go on numerous and just several, the New Testament is filled with his actions. He went on 3 separate missionary journeys. And on these missionary journeys, what he would go to towns that didn't have Christianity, didn't know about Jesus Christ, didn't have a church that preached Jesus Christ. And he went there, and Saul would spend time, whether it was Ephesus, Corinth, and so on and so forth, and he would establish a church. And on these missionary journeys, not only would he establish a church, he would establish a preacher to stay there at that city. And he would disciple these people and show them, hey, I'm well educated in Judaism that you probably believe now. I'm well educated in Christianity. But this is the way, the truth, the life. And he would teach them. And then on his 3rd missionary journey, he revisited a lot of his churches that he had planted to check up on them. Hey, how you doing? Do you need prayer? Do you need discipling? And he would go and feed the love of Jesus Christ to the people that he had started. And through all this, do you think it was easy for Paul? Nah, not even close. He went. And he had persecution. He was thrown in prison. He was beat because he followed what God had put on his heart. We see that Paul wrote several letters, and it constitutes almost half of that Bible you have, or the New Testament that you have in your Bible today. Almost half. Saul became Paul, and Paul followed God's direction for his life. Here was a man whose job was to kill people just because they said Jesus Christ is Lord. That was his job. He woke up and went to sleep doing that. And he enjoyed it. And then we see a transformation occur. And we see this transformation occur to where he receives the Son of God and sees that he is the way, the truth, the life, and that he was wrong this entire time and followed through with that. I want to ask you this question, and we're going to close with this. What have you done lately? What's your excuse? Because if you're anything like me, because I'm probably the worst in this room about it, is making excuses, right? Oh, man, my past is so bad. Back in those days when I was in high school, when I was in college, back in those days when I was at that job, I was just so bad that there's no way that God can use me now. I'm here this morning, but that's about as far as I go. But Monday through Saturday, I'm way too bad in my weekly walk. I use a certain language, I act a certain way at work. So if I was to go on Monday morning back to work and I was to tell these people that I was at Village Park Church on Sunday listening to some preaching and in fellowshipping with awesome people, they would laugh at me. I went to Baptist Bible College. In my freshman year, I came back. And in the summer I came back, and as I came back from Bible college, there was Frank and Fernando, we called him Fern, Romo. And I stood in their front yard just catching up because I've known them since elementary. And I spent the night at their houses and, grew up with these guys. And I come back. Where are you going to college at now, Mark? I go to Baptist Bible College. You go to where? Baptist Bible College in Springfield, Missouri. Are you going to be one of them preachers? I said, well, whatever the Lord has me to do. Oh, you're one of them Jesus freaks, aren't you? I am what I am. They never called me again. They never wanted to hang out again. They wanted nothing to do with me. Because my past with my friends, maybe I was too different from them. Maybe I was acting too different. Maybe they didn't want nothing to do with this Jesus stuff. I don't know. But I made that excuse to say, you know what? I don't need them then. I won't talk to them anymore. I don't need to talk to them. They don't want to talk to me. I won't talk to them. And I never tried to share the gospel with them guys. And I know one wound up being a drug dealer, and I know one was down in Brownsville in prison for 15 years for trying to shoot somebody with an AK-47 in Greenspoint Mall. And I wonder, would their lives have changed if I tried to stay in their lives or not? But I made that excuse. My past will haunt me. They don't think I'm good. Excuse. And that's what we give. But then we see Saul, and I just showed you a man who is worse than any of us, or probably all of us put together, who could change his life and be so impactful for Jesus Christ. What can we do? Because my challenge this morning to you as we close is God can use each and every one of you. Don't look at your past, look at your future. Look what you can do and how you can impact one person in your life for the cause of Christ. Are you ready? Let's pray.